It's 1973. A frightened 12-year-old girl is lying on a gurney at NYU Medical Center. She's about to receive a carotid angiography to see if something is wrong with the blood flow to her brain. The doctor thinks she's been afflicted with a rare chemical electrical disturbance in her temporal lobe. Maybe it's a lesion, and that's why she's been experiencing extremely violent convulsions and bizarre, terrifying hallucinations. She winces in pain as a radiologist inserts a catheter into her neck. Blood spurts from the other end, splattering across her and the doctor's gown. With her chin strapped down with tape, the angiography camera kicks in. The girl is petrified, but it is the only way they'll know what's wrong with her. But when the doctors look at the x-rays, nothing makes sense. The images are clear of abnormalities. A day or two later, the doctor visits the girl at home. She's in bed, screaming, convulsing. It's as if an invisible hand has taken control, lifting her entire body and slamming her into the bed. It sounds like a movie. It is. The Exorcist. But the real horror was off camera. One of the cast members in the hospital scene was a real radiographer. It was a small part, but for a non-actor, he did a fantastic job. His name was Paul Bateson. And a few years after his work on The Exorcist, he'd be called a psychopath. Not just a psychopath, but very possibly a bona fide serial killer. A maniac who stalked the streets of New York City and was said to have committed the vilest of crimes. On September 14, 1977, Addison Verrill, a Variety magazine journalist and Princeton graduate, was found stabbed and beaten to death in his Greenwich Village apartment. The New York Times will later say his head had been crushed. For homicide investigator Lieutenant John Yuckness, this wasn't a regular break-in that had turned violent. This perpetrator seemingly hadn't stole anything. Verrill's TV, his typewriter, and his tape recorder were all still there. Maybe the killer had wanted money or hidden jewelry. Yuckness noted that there were empty beer cans lying around and glasses of half-drunk liquor. It looked as if Verrill had been entertaining someone, and that person had murdered him and ransacked the apartment. The night before, Verrill had been at an after-hours gay venue, the Mine Shaft, a members-only BDSM leather bar in New York's meatpacking district. Verrill hadn't left the bar until about 6 a.m., and he'd very likely not left alone. He was known to pick up random strangers. "Two toes out of the closet," said an article in the Village Voice, hinting that Verrill was happy to explore his sexual identity when he wasn't writing pieces about how the porn industry had suddenly exploded onto the scene. He was hanging out with its film directors and actors. Porn, homosexuality. The US media, and certainly the NYPD, were still very hesitant to talk openly about these aspects of American life. So when a gay man was murdered, it usually didn't make the newspapers. Same-sex sexual activity was illegal in New York under the sodomy laws, and it wouldn't be legalized until 1980. It still happened, of course, but for most of society it remained taboo. As the Village Voice put it, this often meant gay men hanging out in dark bars at odd hours, places where they wouldn't be harassed or abused, but that made those places hunting grounds for the killers that lurked in the shadows. The paper warned that psychopaths were targeting men where they thought they were safe, and when such men were attacked, the reaction was often the same. They'd brought it on themselves. Men were dying, often in brutal circumstances. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Some were found beaten to death, some found mutilated, some dismembered, their heads and limbs and torsos turning up in the river in plastic bags. It was these killings that became known as the bag murders. The Village Voice said 4 sexually oriented gay men, on average, were being murdered every year in the early 70s, just in Greenwich Village. Whoever was committing these crimes was getting away with it. And to make it worse, witnesses were usually too afraid to come forward. They were worried that people would find out how they had been spending their time. So this was the theory, that Verrill had likely been murdered by a homophobic man, or possibly a man disgusted with his repressed sexual desires. Critics said the police barely even investigated cases where gay men were slaughtered. But the NYPD put 12 detectives on the Verrill case. Unlike the others who had been murdered, he was a media celebrity. But then, just 8 days after the murder, the case was blown wide open. All because of a phone call. Not to police, but to a gay rights activist and journalist, Arthur Bell, the Village Voice writer who had written the only media piece about Verrill's extremely violent death. "I killed Addison Verrill." That's what the man on the other end of the line told the news desk. He called twice, a woman picking up both times. A nut, she called him, when she told Bell that this man refused to say anything else until he spoke with Bell himself. She said the man sounded theatrical, quite upbeat, and he was very impressed with Bell's news article. But there was something he wanted to correct. In the story, Bell had called him a psychopath. He didn't agree with that assumption. "He's calling back in 5 minutes. Should I give him your number?" "Absolutely," said Bell, not really believing that the caller could be the man who murdered Verrill. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. This time, Bell picked up. "I'm not a psychopath," the guy on the other end said. "The article was great, but that fact needed changing." "Who are you?" asked Bell. "I just told you," replied the caller. "I killed Addison Verrill." The man wouldn't give his name, but explained he was an alcoholic gay man. He claimed he murdered Verrill simply because he needed the money. On the night of the murder, he had been broke and had bumped into Verrill in the Badlands, a popular gay venue in the West Village. Verrill was kind. He offered to buy him a beer. As they both drank, Verrill then revealed he had cocaine, marijuana, and some amyl nitrate or poppers. Mentioning the last substance usually meant one thing. They were already drunk and high when at about 3 a.m. they went to the mine shaft. By this point, the caller had said he was realizing he was hanging out with a superstar and desperately wanted to go back to his apartment. And that's where they headed at about 6. More coke, more beers, liquor, sex, and amyl nitrate. And it was already 7:30 a.m. Verrill told the guy he had to go to work. The caller told Bell this had upset him. He figured he'd been used for sex. His exact words to Bell were that their sexual liaison didn't feel very reciprocal, and he needed money. Without more alcohol, he'd go into withdrawals and start shaking. So he did something he, quote, hadn't done before. He grabbed a frying pan from the kitchen and smashed Verrill's head open. He proceeded to get a knife from the kitchen drawer and plunged it into Verrill's chest. Oddly, he told Bell that he'd inserted it too high when he should have gone for the right or left side, an important detail for when Bell later spoke to detectives. He took $57, over $300 today, and left. He also took Verrill's MasterCard, passport, and some clothes, using the cash to stay drunk and hang out in gay bars for the next few days. All of these details were important, as was the fact that the caller told Bell exactly what he looked like. 30s, shortish, slim. He said he always wanted to work in the arts, maybe as a dancer, maybe an actor of some sort. Bell wasn't sure whether to believe him when he said he'd actually once had a part in a blockbuster movie. One thing was clear, this guy was desperate for attention. But that didn't make him a murderer. For Detective Yuckness, the caller had to be the killer. He'd known too many key details not to have been involved. It was now a matter of tracking him down. They couldn't trace the call, but they put Bell's house under surveillance, and they waited for the man to make another move. He didn't do anything, but someone else did. "I know who killed Addison Verrill." That was Mitch, an alias, speaking to Bell on the phone. He said that he had met Verrill's killer at St. Vincent's Hospital and they'd quickly become friends. The guy was a serious alcoholic whose drinking had led him to losing his job as an X-ray technician. The day after he'd murdered Verrill, he called Mitch to get it off his chest. And yes, Mitch knew his real name. It was Paul Bateson. Detective Yuckness wasn't convinced Bateson was the killer. He had no record of violence. But when the police went to question him at his apartment, he said exactly what he told Bell. The credit card, the passport, the knife plunged into the middle of the chest. He even knew about the white substance police had found on the bedroom floor at Verrill's apartment. Forensics hadn't been able to identify it, but Bateson knew intimately what it was. Crisco, an oil-based shortening for cooking that can be used as a lubricant. Detectives tried to figure out what kind of man Bateson was. Little was known about him. He was a drifter, a loner, and he certainly had a serious alcohol problem. He had to carry a card around with him stating he was an alcoholic. He was known to hang around gay bars and had been seen marching for gay pride. Unlike some homosexuals in 1970s New York, he didn't make a secret of his sexuality. So for the investigators, this obviously wasn't a case of homophobia that had turned violent. And another thing the detectives found out, Bateson hadn't been lying when he told Bell he'd once appeared in a major movie. What they now knew was The Exorcist. They couldn't believe it. Here, they had a man who had acted in a film that had scared them half to death. But why kill someone when he had no history of violence? What was the motive? $57? No, that wasn't plausible. And if it wasn't about cash, could it mean they had a mentally ill maniac on their hands who had murdered more than one man? They looked deeper into his background. Bateson was broke, that much was certain. He couldn't hold down jobs. His last one was at the Big Top, a male porn theater on Broadway. He was an usher, but his colleagues told investigators he'd spent most of his time looking for pills that customers had dropped. They ended up firing him because of his alcohol problem. The question was, who had he met there watching porn late at night, and what was he doing with all of the drugs he was finding? But there was another side to him. He was clearly an intelligent man. His former colleagues at the hospital said he'd been a great asset to the radiography department. Gentle, clever, and skilled. There was much more to Bateson than met the eye. When police had interviewed him at his apartment, he'd immediately come clean. But he was drunk, actually wasted. So back at the station, detectives gave him some coffee to sober him up. And then he gave a similar statement. One of the detectives contacted Bell. Everything matches. He also admitted that he phoned you and he led us to Verrill's missing passport and credit cards. But later, during the preliminary court hearings, Bateson claimed he'd only made those statements because he'd been extremely drunk. He denied making the phone call to Bell, claiming the reason he knew the details of Verrill's murder was he had read them in a newspaper article. But how did he know about the Crisco? This case wasn't just about one murder. Gay men had been going missing in New York with frightening regularity. Dismembered bodies had been washing up in the Hudson River, 6 of them, and all connected to New York's gay scene. One of the medical examiners had written in his report that, quote, the person who cut up those bodies was a person who was either a butcher or a person with medical knowledge because of the way the cuts were done. Bateson used to be a radiology technician. He would have medical knowledge. But that didn't mean that he was capable of being Jack the Ripper. Detectives had other reasons to believe Bateson might be behind the bag murders. None of the 6 victims were identified. Some of their clothing could be traced to a shop in Greenwich, known for selling leather items popular in the gay scene. But the evidence that stood out was that the killer had used bags that seemed to have come from NYU Medical Center's neuropsychiatric unit, the same hospital where Bateson had once worked. It was around this point that the Exorcist director, William Friedkin, got wind of what had happened to one of his former extras. He'd been reading the New York Daily News. When he saw Bateson's face in a picture, he saw that he had possibly murdered a number of men connected to the gay scene and New York's S&M clubs. It was a great story, and great stories can make great movies. And that's what he had to do, make a movie about his own former extra who'd become a serial killer. The article Friedkin had read said 8 or 9 murders, but only 6 bodies were found in the river bags. The rest, other unsolved murders of gay men in New York City. One of the victims had been stabbed to death and was found charred on a couch that had been set on fire. In another case, 2 gay men were murdered in their apartment, both stabbed. The killer had drowned the men's pet poodle in the kitchen sink. Rumors circulated that another victim had been decapitated. Police tried to quell those rumors. They said some of them were, quote, grossly exaggerated. But it was a fact that someone was going around killing gay men, and whoever was doing it had been invited into their apartments. These were brutal murders, but as a gay rights activist told the New York Times, the NYPD only seemed to show a half-hearted interest. They wouldn't even let the public know the details. A total blackout. It was usually journalists who broke the news. So for Friedkin, this wasn't just a murder story, it was a cultural benchmark. A matter of breaching taboos and controversy. A perfect follow-up for The Exorcist. Another shocker for bloodthirsty audiences. He got straight on the phone with Bateson's lawyer. He didn't mind Friedkin going out to Rikers Island to speak to Bateson himself. Friedkin came right out with it. Did you kill all those men? In Friedkin's version of the events, Bateson then replied, I remember murdering this one guy, Addison Verrill. He then went through the story. The alcohol, the drugs, the sex, the frying pan, and the knife in the chest. Friedkin listened as Bateson, sounding almost cheerful, told them that he'd cut up Verrill's body and dumped the body parts in plastic bags in the East River. He admitted that he'd been too hasty because those bags contained the words, property of NYU Medical Center Neuropsychiatric Center. Bateson added, that is the only one I remember, but they wanted me to confess to 5 or 6. If he did admit to those, he was told his sentence would be shorter. Now this is the strange part. While several gay men's bodies had been dismembered and dumped, Verrill's wasn't one of them. He was found in one piece in his apartment, so why would Bateson have told Friedkin he had cut Verrill into pieces? Bateson also told Friedkin that he had nothing to do with the other bodies. Those bodies, the limbs, heads, torsos, were in police custody, each of them labeled the CUPPI killings, meaning circumstances unknown pending police investigation. Detectives were certain that Bateson had killed those men, but they couldn't yet prove it. Friedkin walked out of the jail that day with a plan. He reached out to Matthew Iannello, aka Matty the Horse, a Genovese crime family mafioso who owned the Mine Shaft and several other gay bars in downtown New York. With an invite from Iannello to visit his clubs, Friedkin was able to write the movie Cruising, an Al Pacino thriller about a serial killer who murders young men from New York's gay scene. The film didn't go down well at all. Well, not with the gay community. 1,000 people marched through the streets in protest. Bell called it the most oppressive, ugly, bigoted look at homosexuality ever presented on screen. But Friedkin got one thing right. New York at the time was a dangerous place to be gay. Maybe Bateson had gotten what he always wanted, to be famous. He now had a part in a hit movie, and he'd served as the inspiration for another Hollywood blockbuster. He always wanted attention ever since growing up in small-town Pennsylvania, where he dreamed of escape from his strict religious parents. He'd tell Friedkin years later that he'd only agreed to take a part in The Exorcist to get back at his strict father. But no matter where he went or what he did, his demons always followed him. As a young man, he tried the U.S. Army, but after drinking heavily when he was stationed in West Germany, he was discharged. He then wound up in New York City, embracing the sexual desires he'd had since he was young. It was a pity he drank so much, because people who worked with him at NYU Medical Center would later say he was a gifted technician, very intelligent and very good with patients. He was an asset to the department, one of the doctors said, noting that no one would ever have believed Bateson could have ever seriously hurt a person. Bizarre, said another, who called Bateson the best and most experienced radiology technologist he'd ever worked with. Either Bateson wasn't the man who had committed all those murders, or he was a Jekyll and Hyde character. Maybe it was the alcohol that brought out the monster. He was now sober in jail and regretting all the time he'd wasted drinking. Friedkin wasn't the only person who visited him. The journalist Arthur Bell also went. Bateson wouldn't talk about the crimes he was accused of, likely on orders of his lawyer, but he said that he was happy to be sober. The thing he missed the most was the ballet. With the gold crucifix his mother had sent him hanging around his neck, he looked almost like a priest. He told Bell that out in the world, he'd reached a point where he needed a few shots of vodka just to stop the shakes. He was drinking at least a quart, nearly a liter, every day. Bell listened closely, trying to work out whether the man in front of him was a serial killer. Bateson opened up. He said that when he drank heavily, he often blacked out, waking up with no memory of what he had done the night before. Was that when he was going out killing? If Bateson really was a psychopath, Bell could feel the charm people always talk about. Bateson knew how to talk, how to make himself liked. Bell couldn't help it. This man had murdered his friend, and still, he felt drawn to him. As he left the visiting area, Bateson told him that he wished he could go home with him. And Bell admitted that under different circumstances, he probably would have gone. But he also knew that might well have been the end of him. Maniac or one-off monster. He just couldn't be sure. At Manhattan Supreme Court, prosecutor William Hoyt looked at Justice Morris Goldman and said, without a doubt, Mr. Paul Bateson was a psychopath. He hadn't just murdered Addison Verrill, he'd been murdering gay men for years. Hoyt brought before the court a witness named Richard Ryan. Ryan claimed he knew Bateson, and Bateson had once admitted to him that he had murdered 3 men, 29-year-old Ronald Cabot, 41-year-old Donald McNiven, and 53-year-old John Beardsley. All the men were associated with the leather bar scene, and they'd all ended up being murdered, stabbed to death. After meeting them in gay bars in 1973, Bateson may have used the same charm Bell had seen at the jail, persuading them to let him return to their lower Manhattan apartments. There, he likely drank with them, slept with them, and then killed them. What he did with the bodies, Ryan didn't know. But he did say Bateson had also told him he had murdered 6 other men he had met in nightclubs. He dismembered each of them and dumped their bodies in the Hudson River. He'd allegedly told Ryan that cutting up the bodies and disposing of them in plastic bags was the hard part. The killing part was easy. The prosecutor, backed by the cops, said he had no doubt at all that Bateson was a serial killer. He fit the profile, glib, slightly unhinged, A seemingly traumatic childhood, strict religious parents, and guilt over his sexuality. He couldn't hold down a job, petty crime, and a yearning for the spotlight. And there was no doubt at all he had murdered Verrill. The judge disagreed, though, about the others. He called the evidence to support Bateson being behind the Bag murders as ephemeral. Some thought the judge was wrong, that he had let Bateson off very lightly. Maybe it was true, and maybe there was a reason he was so lenient. We'll come back to that later on. In court, Bateson still denied murdering Verrill and maintained he hadn't made that phone call to Bell. As for all the other crimes, he told the judge, "I still contend that I am not guilty of the crimes, and I am not the person described by Mr. Hoyt at all." But the evidence against him for Verrill's murder was indisputable. He was sentenced to 20 to life. Not once in prison would he admit to the Bag murders. A lot of things about this case just didn't make sense. Bateson might have told director William Friedkin that he chopped up a body and dumped it in the river. No one else ever heard that detail. Friedkin emphasized it in later interviews. Whether Bateson actually said it or Friedkin made it up, the only person who knew for sure was Bateson himself. In 2003, at the age of 63, he was released. In 2018, a journalist working for Esquire tried to find him. He figured he was still alive because there was no official record of his death. He dug a little deeper and discovered Bateson was probably living in Long Island, a village called Freeport. He tried what he thought was Bateson's phone number, but it was disconnected. He also found email addresses and wrote to those. Some bounced back, some went unanswered. Friedkin refused to speak to the journalist about Bateson allegedly telling him he'd dismembered Verrill. The journalist had no other choice but to go to the NYPD records. He couldn't find any evidence that the cops had ever linked Bateson to the Bag murders, nor did he see anything about the body parts being dumped in bags that had once belonged to NYU Medical Center. He couldn't even find evidence that said police had offered Bateson a deal. Confess to the other murders and you'll get a shorter sentence. Had Friedkin made that part up in an attempt to bring attention to the movie? To create a mythology around it? Or had someone purposefully gotten rid of all the evidence? Had there been a cover-up? And if so, why? Because one thing is certain, if Bateson didn't murder all those gay men, someone else did. Richard Cottingham was a professional man of high intelligence with a wife and children at home. But in his spare time, he murdered and dismembered women across New York. Between 1972 and 1980, he became known as the Torso Killer. Convicted of only 10 murders, investigators and serial killer expert Peter Vronsky later uncovered evidence suggesting he may have tortured and killed dozens, possibly 80, maybe even 100 women. All the known victims were women, but did he murder a few gay men? Maybe, maybe not. But this was during what some would call America's golden age of serial killing. It's possible one or even more serial killers were operating in New York City in the early 70s. But if anyone besides Bateson was the Bag murders killer, it surely had to be Richard Rogers, aka the Last Call Killer. He was a former grade A student who was a crushing disappointment to his tough guy dad. He didn't like the fact that his soft-spoken son wasn't big on hunting wild animals. But hunting humans? That was a different matter. He murdered and dismembered 2 gay men in 1992 and 1993 after meeting them in Manhattan piano bars. He'd be convicted of both of those murders, but were they just the tip of the iceberg? The timeline doesn't fit for the Bag murders, but maybe he'd started killing when he was still young. The police were quite sure that he had. In 1973, when Rogers was a promising graduate student at the University of Maine, he had bludgeoned his roommate to death with a hammer, strangled him, and dumped the body. He claimed self-defense at the trial, used what would become known as the gay panic defense, stating that he was only defending himself from a perverted homosexual whose advances had frightened him. In the 1970s, this kind of thing could work. He was eventually acquitted, later moving to New York City, where he worked as a surgical nurse at Manhattan's Mount Sinai Hospital. Dismemberment? He probably would have been better at it than a radiologist. Police later said they believed Rogers had started murdering around that time, but they couldn't prove it. In the 1970s, DNA evidence didn't exist, and according to critics, murdered gay men often didn't get thorough investigations. So maybe Rogers had started murdering much earlier, right after killing his roommate. His MO certainly fits the MO of the Bag murders killer. In 1988, a victim barely escaped with his life. Rogers had met him in a Manhattan bar, and after having a drink at his house, he woke up in a drugged daze, with his wrists and ankles fastened together with hospital ID bracelets. As he screamed, Rogers injected him, and he went unconscious again. But Rogers didn't kill him. The man went straight to the authorities, yet unbelievably Rogers was acquitted again, and he didn't stop. He would wait in bars until the last orders were called, and he'd make his move. In 1991, he met a man who was later found dead and castrated. His next victim, Thomas Richard Mulcahy, a 57-year-old father of 4, was stabbed to death and found cut in half in 1992. A bloody compass saw lay in one of the bags his body had been dumped in. In 1993, 44-year-old gay sex worker Anthony Edward Marrero was discovered in 7 pieces, decapitated, torso cut in half, arms and legs severed, all dumped in plastic bags. This pattern repeated with the next victim, Michael J. Sakara, 56. He was last seen drinking with a man at a bar in Greenwich Village. He was discovered in 2 locations, his body also cut in 7 pieces. Detectives eventually tracked Rogers down where they found a Bible in his house with passages highlighted mentioning dismemberment and decapitation next to VHS tapes with horror movies on them. They also found Polaroids of men with sketches of stab wounds on their bodies. So he definitely had killed in the 90s, almost certainly in the 80s, and probably in the 70s during his wilder days. He was definitely in the right place at the right time and had the skills and the madness to have been the bag murders killer. But Bateson still wasn't off the hook. Not in the court of public opinion. Where did he go after prison? That day when he talked to Arthur Bell from his jail cell, he'd given a clue. One of the last things he told Bell was about the trial. A lot of people will be hurt, parents, friends. I'll be judged not guilty. Then I'll tear up my roots and settle somewhere else and try to grow new roots. That's what he did. The evidence shows after being released in 2003 from Arthur Kill Correctional Facility on Staten Island, the New York State's Department of Corrections and Community Supervision released him from parole in November 2008. The Esquire journalist discovered Bateson had moved to Long Island. In the U.S. Social Security Death Index, there is a Paul F. Bateson who shared Bateson's date of birth and had his Social Security number. He died on September 15, 2012, age 72, in New York City. Did Bateson really get away with serial killing, all while gay activists warned authorities they weren't doing enough? Could the cops have deliberately buried the case? Over the years, were the cold hard facts blurred with fiction?